So in this video, we're going to continue looking at transformations of the absolute value function, and we're going to look at how the h value will actually transform the absolute value graph. So here you should be familiar with the parent graph of the absolute value function. So notice here we have y equals the absolute value of x. We created a table of values here by using x values from -2 to 2 and finding their corresponding y values. We plotted them over here. We noticed that this graph has a V shape, and then we found that our domain is all real numbers, and our range is y is greater than or equal to 0. So this is the graph you should be familiar with. And what we're going to do here is we're going to experiment and see what happens when we add a value inside of the absolute value function. So what happens when we add a value to x inside of here? And we're going to call that value h. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually go into Desmos and we're going to change the value for h. So this is the part we're focusing on right here. We're going to actually use this slider and change the value for h. So notice here as I change h from 0 to something positive, look at how it starts to move. So notice that the shape of the graph doesn't change, but that the graph is moving to the left. And notice here when h is at 6, the graph has moved to the left or in the negative direction 6. So I can see that relationship between the 6's, but what I'm noticing here is that the graph is moving the opposite direction of what I expected. The graph is actually moving to the left even though the positive 6 is to the right. So with h, I'm starting to make this prediction of h is some sort of horizontal movement along the x's, but it's the opposite of what I expect. So when h is 6, it's moved to the left 6 units. Now I'm going to experiment and see, okay, what happens if I make h negative, if I futz with it that way. So here I'm going to take h and I'm going to move it in the negative direction. So notice if I go to -3, this graph has moved 3 units in the positive right direction. If I go to -4, I notice it's moved 4 units in the positive direction. So what I'm noticing here is h is a horizontal movement, but it's the opposite of what I expect. If h is positive, it's moving in the negative x direction, and if h is negative, it's moving in the positive direction. So here, we're going to go back and we're going to summarize our thoughts in our notes here. So the first thing we're going to add in here is we're going to actually make a comment that h is our horizontal shift. So it's how we move left to right. So that's the first thing. And the easy way to remember this is h stands for horizontal. Now the next thing we need to summarize is what happens when h is positive and what happens when h is negative. So I noticed that when h was positive, the graph moved horizontally, and when it was positive, it moved towards the negative number, so it moved left that many units. So if h equals 6, the graph moves left 6 units. And think about it when it's compared to the parent graph. So that's when h is positive. It moves the opposite of what we expected. It moves to the left in the negative x direction that many units. Then if h is negative, so say we have the graph moved horizontally, we know that's happening. But remember, when h is negative, it's going to move towards the positive h value. So it's going to move horizontally right that many units. So to kind of summarize it in the same way, if h equals -6, the graph moves right 6 units when compared to the parent graph. So just to reiterate, if we can go back here, when h is a positive number, like say +4, the graph moves in the negative x direction 4 units. So that's to the left 4 units. If h is -4, it moves towards the +4, so to the right 4 units. So that h value tells us our horizontal shift. Remember, then the k value told us our vertical shift. So these two together tell us how that absolute value graph actually moves around the coordinate plane. Now, the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to summarize our notes here and do a couple of examples. So here we have y equals the absolute value of x minus 5, and we need to figure out how that graph is going to compare to the parent graph. So the first thing I notice here is that h is equal to -5. So because I have an h value, I know that that's a horizontal movement. So the graph is going to move, and it's a -5, so it's the opposite of what I expect. So it's going to move in the positive right direction 5 units. Then here, if I look over here, again, I see an h value. This time I see an h value of 2. So I have h is equal to 2. Because I have an h value, I know that it's a horizontal movement. So the graph is going to move. Then I think, okay, it's a positive 2. H values move the opposite of what I expect. So I'm going to move in the negative x direction, which is left 2 units.